told us that no matter which growth strategy the city was going to go with, there was going to be neighborhoods and communities that were disproportionately impacted by displacement and low access to opportunity. So that analysis was followed by an equitable development implementation plan, which was followed by equitable development financial strategy that had funding to support and invest in community-driven projects. Next. So Equitable Development's origin story. This is an initiative that was born out of inside-outside strategy. The origin story, the South Communities Organizing for Racial Regional Equity, a coalition convened by Puget Sound SAGE, about 21 organizations at the time, with a mission to be community control and inspired development, mostly in Rainier Valley. And those organizations are mostly communities of color-led organizations, came together to infuse equity in the comprehensive plan. And then the Race and Social Equity Task Force, which consisted of leaders from different neighborhoods, mainly Central Area, Chinatown, Rainier Valley, and in Othello, specifically in Rainier Beach, came together to advocate and implement the Equitable Development Implementation Plan. Next, and that's like the EDI Advisory Board, Interim Advisory Board, and the Review Committee from 2018. As I said, it's an inside-outside strategy, so the program, the funding is and informed by the communities most impacted by growth. So we are a values-based program, starting with acknowledging historic injustices, just recognizing that even with the implementation plan itself, with the equity analysis, you could see that those communities who are impacted by the displacement are also the same communities that suffered from widespread disinvestments, redlining, and other racialized policies. And just with this one, we value efforts that are explicitly about addressing systemic racism and institutional barriers that a lot of the communities that we work with are affected by. We center communities most impacted by displacement, like I said earlier, and value efforts that focus the decision-making processes into the structures of community development with clear external and internal accountability processes. We believe in community self-determination and invest in community-driven strategies that influence that communities most impact influence the program and in the driver's seat. We also value organizations that reflect the complexity of community needs. And when we say community needs, I'll talk about a little bit more about the equity drivers, but we really look at organizations that influence, for example, affordable housing, cultural development, healthcare, and economic development. And then, as I talked about earlier, we support efforts which are most likely to bring improvement and lead to racial equity outcomes for communities most impacted by displacement and lack of access to opportunity. And also, as far as leverage is concerned, the efforts that we support is leveraging community resources and supporting the existing assets available in these communities and building on their local cultural assets. And then we strive to create processes that reduce barriers to participation with providing a fair structure for all communities seeking to participate in the Equitable Development Initiative. And then finally, we are a systemic change program because our funding is intended to advance projects that reimagine the development process in a way that prioritizes long-term benefits and capacity for community members. Next, Michael. Are you stuck?
No, sorry, I was chatting.
So as I said earlier, starting with one of our values around and kind of recognizing and and historic injustices. This is a map from 1930s, disinvestment and redlining from for the city of Seattle specifically. The blues and greens are areas that were color coded best and still desirable, and was known for the high proportion of white communities. And the areas that were graded definitely declining and hazardous, where these decisions that were made contributed to even the inequities we're seeing right now. Neighborhoods that right now are known for their kind of density of people of color. Next. These are the maps that came from the equity analysis that I mentioned earlier when I started this presentation. And on my left is the risk of displacement, where the areas that are showing red are areas that have high risk displacement, and then the blues are areas that have low displacement risk. And so if you looked at the map I just shared before this map, the areas that were graded hazardous and definitely declining are today's areas that have a high risk displacement, and in some neighborhoods also low access to opportunity. And then, like I said earlier, are known for their density of people of color. On the right is the access to opportunity map that also came from this equity analysis from over 5 years ago, and the areas south of the Ship Canal that are kind of colored brownish areas that have low access to opportunities. The neighborhoods that we mostly work with and the groups that were part of forming and advocating for the equitable development were mostly from, in central area, Chinatown and Rainier Valley. And some of these neighborhoods like Chinatown and central area are kind of seen as a high access to opportunity neighborhoods in this map. But we have seen that those communities, especially communities of color, those neighborhoods don't have access to these jobs or transit, dependable transit, and at risk of displacement, like I said earlier. And then the south of Ship Canal are known for not having access to opportunity. Next. So this is an example of the layers that were used in the equity analysis index. So the one on my left, again, is proximity to regional job center, which kind of shows us, I didn't have coffee yet, travel time to the designated county urban centers and where jobs are. Again, if you and remember the maps I shared, is areas that had either low access to opportunity, high risk displacement, again, are those in neighborhoods that are not close to regional job centers. On the right side is household income, which shows the percentage of population with income below 200% of the federal poverty level. Again, you see the colors, how different they are, and who they disproportionately, which neighborhoods they disproportionately impact based on what I just mentioned. Next. So I showed a lot of maps, but this is another way to look at those neighborhoods that we invest in and focus in as EDI. These priority neighborhoods have high levels of both chronic and recent displacement risks. They have suffered from racially driven disinvestments. Again, as I said, a significant population of marginalized communities, and then also as these neighborhoods and these communities are suffering from all this, they also have community-driven strategies, which was created through inclusive community engagement. Like, for example, Rainier Beach had their neighborhood plan that mentioned the food innovation district that they have been focusing on, for example. And then another kind of concept that we see, something that comes up in these neighborhoods, are they have major transportation investments. As these investments came in, ideally they should be benefiting these communities, but what we have seen is they have contributed to displacement and low access to opportunities for these neighborhoods. Next. So out of all that, the Equitable Development Initiative was born, and the framework pretty much centers strategies that achieve community stability and resilience in the face of displacement, and also create or provide equitable access to all neighborhoods so that everybody has equal access to those, especially amenity-rich, high access to opportunities neighborhoods. Each of our EDI grantees bring at least 3 of the equity drivers together in one project. For example, and let's say I used Rainier Beach as an example. I'm going to just continue with that. They are doing a food innovation district using the light rail station as a catalyst and building on the local cultural assets of those communities where that neighborhood has the most diverse ethnicities and communities in the whole of the United States, right? So what they're doing is like they're using that as a catalyst and building on those local cultural assets of their neighborhoods, while figuring out with their affordable housing vision how they're preventing residential displacement and also utilizing the commercial space for the food idea that they have. So in their case, I'll say that they at least bring 4 of these equity drivers. Next. So we, as I mentioned, a values-based program, which really flips this idea of helping others to like, how do we work together with these impacted communities to advance the racial equity outcomes that is gonna help them, not help them, I shouldn't use help, that will ensure that they advance the outcomes that they have come together and the vision that they have come together as a group. Next. And a lot of times, especially with philanthropy and government, we have this deficit-based language of, and as we're investing in these communities, does this group have, capacities? For example, questions that we ask. And how are we managing risks as we are talking to these communities and working with these communities and investing in them? But we also flipping the script to figure out like, what are we doing to, really fail forward and work together with these communities to advance the equitable outcomes that they have set out. So this year we have about $5.8 million available from the fund. We had another $5.2 million specifically for site acquisition. And I think Michael is gonna talk about that. Next. Yeah, that's you.
Okay, I'll jump in. I think both of you are generally familiar with kind of how we talked about the EDI in the past. And so, we sort of distinguish between the things that are going to, whatever the Equitable Development Initiative is working on is going to hold true to some core things. And those are some of the stuff that Uba talked about previously. And so those are going to be the sort of the fundamentals of the program. And that's, prioritizing the high risk of displacement communities, ensuring that there's accountability between community and the organization that wants to do the work by looking at the depth of relationship between the project organization and the folks on the ground who the project's supposedly going to be supporting, and then the 6 equity drivers that Uba mentioned. There are other criteria that come into play that are somewhat tend to be adapted to the specific circumstances of various RFPs. So for example, geographic distribution to make sure that the EDI is, while it has its place-based priorities in high-risk displacement areas, making sure that funds are flowing to high risk displacement that maybe don't always get the same level of attention as other places. And, Ming, I know that you you and the folks at Lake City beat this drum all the time about being one of those neighborhoods that has a lot of displacement issues, but doesn't always land on people's radar. So this geographic criteria is a way of just elevating for the review committee to remember places that don't necessarily get the same kind of press that other neighborhoods do. The unmet needs is really, since EDI is a relatively small program compared to other capital funding programs, really looking at where are our dollars entering into whatever the project is or the idea is in a way that doesn't just duplicate what other funders are doing, but is there something that we can do that's either strategic or additive to the work that is already going on. In this case, as we'll talk about a little bit more, because there's not as much emphasis on capital projects this time, the unmet needs is really around sort of the services and supports that are going to community that are responding to all of the various crises of 2020. And so, again, there are lots of funding streams that are providing lots of resources, but there's also gaps. And so trying to think about, how does an application for EDI funding add to the mix of resources that are available to community and not just be, we have this program and we're just asking EDI to do the same thing again. And then always, even though, again, and this is true in the past, but is perhaps a little bit more true today, is looking at what the funding may allow community to do in the next 6 months, a year, 24 months, as at some point we'll be starting the shift towards reinvestment and recovery. And so how do community get positioned to capitalize on the resources that will start to flow? And one of the things that we all realized in 2008, 2009, when the stimulus money started to flow, was that one of the big federal criteria ended up preventing a lot of communities from color from accessing those funds because those neighborhoods were spending their resources on crisis response and supporting their neighbors, and so there wasn't resources necessarily to keep projects on the front burner so that they would be shovel ready when the federal resources flowed. So we're trying to disrupt that system too and get ahead of that so that communities can elevate their projects and can have them ready to move and be more competitive for funding streams that may not take into account community process in the same way. So this is the same as before because it's one of the core criteria, but this is just, again, an example of how we ask the review committee to look at proposals, and it's, really looking at, is there some level of authenticity between, the organization and what they're claiming and who they are and what their history is. And so organizations that have established really deep roots in community and in the neighborhood that they're talking about doing the work and have spent time building the relationships that will make the project successful in the long run are prioritized over organizations that sort of said, oh, we've got this idea and let's parachute into a community and we'll just do the project wherever it makes sense for us as a project without necessarily engaging with community. And obviously there's a pretty big spectrum between those poles. And that's where the hard work of the review committee comes in, is trying to evaluate those. And so, this application again has this core criteria of the displacement and the depth of relationship that carry over in the equity drivers. And then there is new criteria for some of the other things. But these are, again, the equity driver is a core criteria. And so, does it connect to the 3 equity drivers? Is there sort of a logical connection between the project and having some sort of tangible benefit to community members on the ground? The projects that we do are obviously at a scale where we wouldn't be necessarily assuming that we would see neighborhood level change on big demographic data sets. And so there is some level of, what the part of the reason we don't ask for measurable outcomes is because we want to be understanding of the scale that most of these projects are. But we do want to emphasize projects that really will make a difference in people's lives. And so that's part of where we're trying to go with this. And then the other criteria are in the RFP guidance. So I would strongly encourage taking a look at those for the guidance for you as you're writing, and because that's also the guidance that the review committee is going to have to review those applications. So this is your way of sort of getting in their heads early about what their task is. And then, here is an overview of the overall EDI program. We started again back in 2017 and 18 with money from the sale of the Civic Square, which is a city surplus property. We've gotten a small amount of community development block grant every year so far that has historically been very hard to use with our projects. CDBG can sometimes cost more than it provides. And so we've been pretty creative in the past with how to fit this in. We have about 890,000 that's going to existing projects this year because we know that they'll be able to work within the timeline, and the timeline for this RFP isn't going to work for most projects given the federal rules. The regular stable funding source started last year, which is the short-term rental tax. This year we have $5 million coming in again, although it's basically all general fund money because the short-term rental tax isn't producing any revenue because we don't have tourists coming in and staying at Airbnbs. So that revenue is greatly decreased, but the overall amount is the same, and we'll talk about that. And then Uba mentioned the 5.2 million. That is part of 15 million that came from the sale of another surplus property from the city. The remaining 9.8 we'll have access to next year. And again, that is that ask when we got it allocated from the mayor and council was specifically for projects that had received awards, but the award amount was not enough to actually secure property. And rather than see a bunch of projects stuck with no path forward, we created a sort of a dedicated funding source to try to allow them to purchase the properties that they were interested in. And so some of you saw that the Rainier Beach, the RBAC project recently got 2.1 million to close their property, and that's from this. And we have 2 other projects that are in the works with that, and probably the third one or the fourth one will be selected shortly. And so again, whether the original idea for that had been a revolving loan fund, we're not sure whether the 9.8 will be able to do it, so that funding can eventually return. But that's again a specific resource for a specific problem that we were encountering. This year's RFP, as I've mentioned, is a little different because of all of the things that we've been dealing with in 2020, which is both COVID, the economic downturn, and all of the community organizing around structural racism that's going on. And so this RFP is not going to be emphasizing capital projects and is instead going to be emphasizing sort of community-based work in a very flexible way. And so that means that each grant will be only $50,000 and very flexible in how community can use it. So that could be for direct community support. So say you're, trying to stabilize folks who may be getting evicted or have some sort of food access need that's not being met some other way. So those are ways that you could use funding. Certainly if you're doing capacity building or leadership development and you're saying, we need to, as an organization, either just maintain and survive or, make these investments so that we're better able to serve community later. As an example, we have a bunch of direct support dollars from various organizations, but nobody will let us use that money for staff to actually oversee those programs. So that might be a way that you could make the argument there. And certainly, as we talked about planning and strategy as it relates to potential reinvestment and how to prepare for that. So again, the $5 million is essentially broken down like this. This includes the 890 for CDBG. So the existing organizations are getting a big chunk. Basically, what we're doing is generally maintaining their existing funding. And so the idea is rather than do an RFP and have organizations destabilized at a time when our priority is stabilizing, we're trying to just keep the existing EDI partners, help them stay afloat through this, and so that they don't lose momentum and don't backslide with the projects and things they're working on. And this goes back to our, the core value we have of when we start working with projects, we enter into a long-term relationship. And so that means, finding the balance between new applications and new partners and making sure that we walk alongside the partners that we do have, and we don't drop them in their projects and let things fall through the cracks. That money does have a little bit set aside for capital and we're working on the priorities for that. But the idea is basically there are a few projects that are really close to hitting a milestone, and we don't want them to miss that opportunity. And so if there is a little bit there, we're going to try and provide some resource to help them get over that threshold and keep on track. And that's why that bucket is larger compared to the others. The new partnerships is really what this RFP is about. This will support about 40, maybe a few more new projects. Existing organizations are not eligible to apply for this funding, which is sort of our acknowledgement that they've already been taken care of. And so this is really about finding new folks who are doing the work in community, and we need to find ways to support them. And so while this isn't going to bring new development projects online per se, we're hoping that we'll be able to help as many folks as possible make it through all of the things that are going on or do the planning that they need to do to be successful with. We can pivot back to funding real estate and other resources start to come available. And then there's a little bit pulled aside. The Office of Sustainability and the Environment has an environmental justice program that aligned with some of the work that was really important to us around COVID, but also as it relates to food justice and food sovereignty. So we added some money to their fund, which is open now, and everybody's certainly eligible to apply to that. I think there's a link in the RFP guidance if you want to look at that. And so we've doubled the amount of money they have available so they can have a more meaningful investment in those partners. And so, it's perfectly fine for someone to apply to us and get funded and apply to OSE and get funded if there's overlap. And the Seattle Together Partnership is an internal city program that's around sort of civic togetherness as it relates to the COVID response. And so we've added a little bit of money to that to help create some emphasis programming in high risk of displacement neighborhoods. And if you have questions about that, Uba can answer a little more since she sits on that table. So we've broken the 1.5 million down into 3 sort of priority areas. Organizations can apply to all 3 if they want to. And our process has been set up so that we'll have a community-based review committee for each of these priority areas, and then the full group will come back together to review all of the applications and make a final recommendation. And the idea there is this gives folks the opportunity to apply to as many things as they think are good fits, but also gives the review committee a chance to look at the overall sort of portfolio of potential awards and just make sure that, you know, we're getting sort of the coverage that we need. And so, you know, there may be organizations that, you know, really hit the alignment in a number of ways and so are really good at the core areas. And so they're rising to the top in all 3 buckets. But when we look at the aggregate of who's getting recommended, the group may say, you know, giving 150,000 to a much smaller pool of applicants doesn't actually meet the goals that the program set out to do. So, you know, let's make sure that we're meeting the equity goals that the program has overall, and we can support a more varied spectrum of communities that need support. And so that gives us sort of a internal check and balance. The BIPOC social infrastructure is really, again, about sort of connecting to the Black Lives Matter organizing, but also certainly recognizing the increased strain that COVID has on BIPOC communities. And so, you know, what can this funding do to support that sort of organizing work and the people and the organizations that are holding community together? The economic and disaster gentrification is sort of what we talked about before. Disaster gentrification is a term that sort of means when there's an economic downturn, speculators swoop into high risk of displacement neighborhoods and start buying land, and that then sets off this chain of reaction that leads to displacement. So are there strategies that folks can develop now that can help prevent that in neighborhoods that are at risk, while also queuing up their own projects where they make sense? And then the COVID-19 community response and recovery, again, it is both related to, you know, organizations that need backbone support to provide the services that they're providing, and or direct support for providing resources directly to community members that may be impacted. So the timeline, again, the RFP has been released. We're in outreach webinar number 2. The turnaround time is pretty short. It's the 23rd of this month. The application is a lot shorter this year, so each narrative, the narrative is only here to write up and meet the timelines. Each bucket, each priority area, if you want to apply, you can do your own narrative if you want to, or you can use the same one. The idea there being, you know, if you want to customize, you have the opportunity, but you can certainly submit the same thing if what you have is general and it works for all of them. The review committee, again, will meet somewhere between the 7th and the 19th. And again, they have at least 2 meetings, depending on how the conversations go. So there's sort of a range of time to get all the scheduling done. And then they'll make a recommendation that goes into this internal city process. So generally that's taken a month or 2. We're trying to give ourselves a month so that we can have decisions and everybody out before Thanksgiving. So that's what we're targeting. We don't have a ton of control over that, but that's applications, and these are smaller dollar values and are intended to move quickly. We're hoping to have as much contracting as possible done by the end of the year, obviously with holidays. that's not a hard and fast rule. So if folks need a little bit more time, that's okay. But the contract periods, our assumption is that folks should spend down the money by the end of 2021, because this is really about getting dollars out in community as quickly as possible. And then it's all to you guys for questions if you have them. And Uba and I are available, and feel free to chat or just shout them out.
Well, thank you, Michael and Uba. I think that's a great presentation. I just want to make sure I understand the structure of the grants. You're looking for 3 drivers together, and each driver will need to meet the priority of the 3 areas. Is that how it works? I was a little bit lost.
Oh, sure. So the equity drivers are sort of a core function, and the idea behind projects trying to meet 3 equity drivers is that we're a community development fund and not a focus area driven. And so what we don't want is folks coming in and saying, well, we do affordable housing and that's it, and therefore fund us, right? We want to say, well, good, affordable housing is crazy important, but how are you integrating that housing with the community itself? And so how does your strategy connect to the community in more than one way? And so, that could be, we hire people from within the community and we build on, the local cultural assets. And then this has this, anti-displacement function because we're increasing we're creating living wages that would allow people to rent in the neighborhood. And so, once that sort of integration happens, then we're looking at something that is we feel is more designed to meet the needs of the actual the larger community and not sort of the priorities of necessarily the organization itself. And that historically has helped us sort of fend off the parachuting nonprofits that say, well, we do this thing and we've decided that it's anti-displacement because your fund says that it's for anti-displacement, and so we're just going to reframe what we always do and reflect that back to you. And so that's kind of one of the ways we help distinguish between projects that are really community development focused and ones that are sort of loose and have their sort of social service goal, but aren't as deeply connected. And so those equity drivers would apply to any or all of the priority areas, right? They're sort of what we again called the core criteria. And then within, in the RFP guidance, there's sort of a separate set of questions specific to each of those priority areas that would be, how are you, how, I think like for the COVID one, like, how are you identifying whether this funding is duplicative or not of other service dollars that are flowing? And so, our expectation is that whatever, in all cases, you're meeting the equity drivers, and then you sort of can either customize for each of the priority areas or not. You can just sort of say, look, this is general enough, like this covers everything, and we just want to throw our hat in the ring for all 3. Or you could say, this is, this is really very much about disaster gentrification, and it really doesn't make any sense being a COVID support application. Does that help?
So you need to tell them whether or not this is a general or which category you're applying out of the 3. Is that right?
Yeah, so on the application itself, there's checkboxes, so you can check as one or all 3. And then that just allows us to route to wherever you're going. And so Hamdi, you put a question in the chat, is this one application or 2 or more applications? So the application cover sheet, you only need to do once. You can provide narrative for the narrative is 2 pages, and you can do again, one narrative and just check all the boxes on the application, and then we would just make copies and send it out. Or you can say, here's the narrative for the disaster gentrification priority, and here's a different narrative for the COVID recovery. And that, if you want to do that extra work, then that allows you to sort of customize and explain a little better, and create a ton more work for the review committee, but that's what they sign up for. So that's the idea there, is to give folks some options and some flexibility in how they want to engage with the program. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, and then is there like you say pages? How is there length of the proposals you're looking at?
Yeah, so we've asked for them to be no more than 2 pages. And the idea being that this is really kind of like a letter of interest. We're not asking you to fully, send us a fully baked program.
Mm-hmm.
It's really like, well, who are you and what are you doing? And that, because the emphasis is getting dollars out quickly and spreading around a lot more, we're trying not to force people to provide as a deep dive into how the organization and the project works compared to what we would for something where we're potentially allocating millions of dollars for a real estate project. And so hopefully that ends up being easier. I know sometimes people are like, it's actually harder to write smaller, because you feel like you have to fit a lot more content into a smaller amount of space. But we're hoping that this is easier for folks, and we're also hoping that this is easier for the review committee, because what we don't want when we have so many applications is the reviewers getting burned out and then not providing meaningful review to all the folks who apply. And so certainly, after the 35th 10-page application that somebody's reading, they may not be giving it the attention it deserves. And so hopefully this provides a little more focus from everybody, and they're reading everything as fairly as possible.
Great. I have another question. Under the economic recovery and disaster gentrification, it says you need to meet both economic recovery and disaster gentrification in order to apply for that.
It can be sort of where you fit within that. I mean, they're arguably, on the grounds, somewhat 2 sides of the same coin a little bit. Our goal is to sort of highlight both of these as core issues that are coming down the pipe, and to elevate those both within the program, but also within sort of the public consciousness of things that we all need to be working on. So if you're firmly in economic recovery, that shouldn't be an issue.
Okay.
And then a question in the chat: the letter of interest and cover sheet are the same. So the cover sheet is, I don't think I can share without bringing this off. So there's a cover page on the application that's just, who are you, what's your contact information, are you authorized to submit the application by your organization. That can be the same for all of them. And then the questions that are below that for the narrative is the letter of interest part. So those are sort of, those are equivalent things. So that 2-page narrative, you would fill out once if you want to, and check all the boxes, and we would just use the same narrative 3 times. Or you could provide up to 3 different narratives, but the cover sheet would be the same. There's no questions on the cover sheet that would need to change based on the applications, unless, I guess, if you were like, for this one, I only want $25,000 instead of 50, you might want to do a new cover sheet for that. But our assumption has been that everybody's going to be asking for 50,000 because it's not that much money, and we're pretty sure that everybody can use it. So the idea again is the cover sheets for us to route and just make sure that we can get in contact with folks. And then the actual real application is the narrative part. And so there's for the follow-up in the chat, there is nothing else after this. It's really designed to be a really low barrier application process, so folks can, write something up, feel, take your best shot at explanation, and then, despite the fact that it's probably not going to be till close to the end of the year before we can make awards, we've been trying to speed up the process on our side as much as possible to get the dollars out. And we're releasing this a lot later than we had hoped to. And so some of this is us scrambling to catch up to try to get the dollars out by the end of 2021, because it took us a little while to get all the internal pieces in place to be able to release the funding. And some of that is related to all the budget crisis the city went through during the spring and summer. To whether or not we were actually going to have an RFP at all was kind of a question for some amount of time. And so now that we've got locked into the rebalanced city council budget, we know we can move forward and we can actually fund people when we say, here's your award.
Great, thank you, Michael. One other question is, you said that when you apply, you can be any of these 3 categories. Is it just up to the, the people who read a grant decide which one that they want to fund you, or more than one they want to fund you, or or do you try to like give everybody at least one category to be funded, and then decide is there any leftover one for other organizations? You have 2 areas.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so again, we're not, because this is a bit new for us too, we're not entirely sure how this is going to work out. But the idea is that we're maximizing the options for the applicant. And so you can write and say, I want to be considered in all 3. Each priority then gets its own sort of review committee. And so the application is sort of weighed on its merits within each of those 3 priority areas. And then once there's sort of that subgroup of recommendations, and each of those priorities says, okay, these are the ones that we want to move forward, they then move up to this final stage, which is all the reviewers get together in a room and they look at everything that they've recommended and what other folks have recommended. And that's where we get to take sort of one last look at what the aggregate recommendations are and how that fits with the program values. And so that's where there may be something where folks said, oh, the same proposal was recommended in all 3, but if we do that, nothing from, say, Lake City moves forward, right? And so that then becomes something that we want to question, because we have these other priority questions, which are sort of the geographic parity, and we have questions of, and one of the things that's been a question all along in EDI is, if you're talking about anti-displacement, where does the indigenous community fall within that? Because the whole city is a high risk of displacement area, right? And so how does the LGBTQ community show up in that space? Again, because that's not localized to a neighborhood, and so the historic discrimination is much more diffuse. And so there are these larger questions that we do want the review committee to sit with for a while. And so they get to make the decision. And so it may be that a project that everybody's like, nope, that is spot on for all 3 of the drivers. and so we're gonna award them the full 150,000 because, and then do that. Or they may say, they're getting funded, but these are this is the area or the two areas that they're strongest in, and this other one, now that we're seeing the bigger picture, maybe that one's a little weaker, and there's this other organization that really is serving a population that nothing else is serving. And so now that we know that, and we see what the impact would be of not funding them because the other groups aren't funding, the other priorities aren't funding them either, we actually want to bring them and make sure they get something. And so it's sort of a check and balance of allowing applicants to have the most flexibility, while also saying, that may or may not lead to impacts that we didn't want to see. And so how do we navigate through that together? So we'll see how it works. There's it's going to be a complicated conversation. But our hope is that we end up with something that's a little more aligned with what the overall program values are.
Great. Do you have a quota for, like, say, certain area you want to, like you're trying to distribute it sort of around the city? So if there's like multiple organizations from the same area, are you looking for a specific number of organizations you want to focus in one area, or?
No, and as we've historically, none of these are, I would say, hard and fast rules. So, if there's a proposal, like if there's only one proposal from a neighborhood and we don't feel like it's a strong enough proposal to like really align with the program, then it may not get funded. What the process is designed to do is sort of say, let's take one more look and say, is the fact that this, is this not getting reviewed on its initial pass as strongly as others? And maybe this is actually a reflection of this being a newer or more grassroots organization. And so, there isn't the history in this neighborhood of established nonprofits with professional grant writers who are doing these things. And this is really a grassroots group that's rising from a place that has not historically been served by nonprofits. And that's why there's a gap. And so maybe the answer is, no, they just did a lousy job and we shouldn't fund them. And then that's, but maybe on second look, we say, you know what, there is actually a serious equity issue here, and we want to make a different decision than what the initial pass would do. And so that's what our process isn't designed to be directive. It's designed to force people to take a step back as a collective decision-making group and really make sure that folks aren't getting left behind who may not have the access that other groups have historically done. Does that make sense?
Yes. Final, my last question is, while running the grant, ourselves, what's the best way we run into questions and not sure we're in the right direction or what category? What's the best way to contact you?
Sure. Email is probably the best, given that we're all working from home. We've been able to respond pretty well to questions or jump on phone calls to talk through more complex issues. The reason we have that last webinar on the 17th is sort of to catch folks who have started writing and maybe some questions come up that are kind of generalizable questions. So that's one way that we've scheduled this to try to help folks get through this. Is maybe spending another hour talking to me isn't what you want to be doing, but the webinar is a way to just sort of tune in a little bit, get something else done while you're waiting to ask your question. And then you can sort of say, okay, I'm writing the application out and this part doesn't make sense to me, or I thought it made sense, but as I'm trying to put words to paper, this isn't as clear as I thought it was. And so that's one tool. But then again, send us an email. If it's a question we can answer in writing, we'll just answer it right back for you. If it's something that's a little more complex and we have to talk it through, we'll reach out and say, can we schedule a call? And if you do it the day before the application is due, we might not, but we will do our best to get back to everybody as quickly as we can.
Well, very helpful. Thank you so much. I'm so glad. I know it's early today. I appreciate you and take the time to go through it and you know, to know that this year actually this RFP actually went through, and the funding for the community. I think it's a wonderful news. So I'm just very pleased to know the city is really doing the outreach and really trying to make this process less cumbersome.
Well,
Thank you for joining at this time too.
Yeah, and as always, I would say, since again, this, we're constantly trying to make adjustments to our process to make it easier for applicants, and so certainly this is a lot different from last time. So if you're going through it and you have feedback that says, this really actually made it harder instead of easier, please feel free to share that information with us, because we are always going to be trying to make the program better. And sometimes we get a lot of feedback from folks and we make a change and we say we think this is going to help. But part of our commitment to accountability is, if we're wrong about something, then we want to be notified of that and then be able to correct the problem.
Thank you. I will sign off. Thank you very much, Michael and Obed. Have a great week.
Yeah, thanks. It's nice to talk to you again.
Yes, and here.
You too. Thank you.
Hamdi, it was nice to chat with you.